Welcome to a presentation on Greenville's oldest houses. I'm Marshall Buttrick, and I will be doing the presentation. The reason I'm doing it is I saw on Facebook a query in the past couple of months wanting to know what was the oldest house in Greenville. And I thought, that would be interesting to research and see what I can come up with. And so before we even start, I'm going to give you my sources of information for this presentation and explain how I got to what I did for dates for the construction of old houses. And so first I'd like to say that settlement in this area really didn't occur heavily until after the Peace of Paris, which ended the French and Indian War. And so in the 1760s, settlement started to open up. And this was a period of time where settlement for this area, for Greenville, Mason, New Ipswich, and so forth, was coming from the southeast, from the towns of Groton, Concord, Acton, Lincoln. And you will see the names of families from those towns are reflected in street names and various locations here in this area. I had to come up with a dividing line of what year do I use as the end point for old houses. And so this talk is dealing with houses that were built up and including to the year 1799. So anything pre-1800 is what we cover. I did not want to go any further in the 1800s because between 1800 and 1850, a much larger number of houses were built in what is today Greenville, and so it's very important. So the first source of information that I want to do is a map that comes from a booklet called Old Maps of Rural Hillsborough County, New Hampshire, which was done in 1892. And it gives you a bit of a starting point. I have both the whole map on the left side that shows the town of Greenville as it was taken from Mason, and then the inset for the village, which was formerly Mason Village. It's good in terms of names, and it gives you a clue as to there are errors on this map. There are roads that actually don't exist that show going from what is now Richardson Road to the Wilton Road. It shows Adams Hill Road as hugging the Mason town line on the east side, and those are errors, but it's a starting point, and it's very helpful as one goes forward. The next map that I use takes us back to 1858. This is a wall map of Hillsborough County, and I've put on the left side what shows all of Mason Village and what is now Greenville, and then there is the insert for Mason Village, which appears on the side of the map. And if you want to access this map, you can just go right into the town clerk's office. It's on the wall on the right, and there it is. It is very accurate, and I like it, and it gives you a starting point as well for doing. There's certain coding that will show. Sometimes you will see an SH for schoolhouse or BS blacksmith shop, and so you can figure those out. Then another source that I have used is a brief history of Greenville that was written by the Reverend George F. Merriam, and that's included in Hurd's History of Hillsborough County, New Hampshire, which was published in 1885. That's a collection of brief histories of the towns of Hillsborough County. George F. Merriam was born upon Merriam Hill and spent his early years there, and then mid-childhood his family went to Temple to live. He went off to Amherst College and then down to Union Theological School in New York, and he became the pastor of the Congregational Church here in Greenville for 30 plus years. And so he had access to information and wrote a good history there that helps us somewhat. Then the best source that I have for information, or what I consider the best, is the John B. Hill History of Mason, New Hampshire, which was published in 1858. That has a number of sources within it. There is the 1753 report to proprietors, in which the proprietors wanted to know what the status of settlement was, and it lists people and what they have done on their lots. There is a 1769 first tax list for the town of Mason, and we look at the west side because that's what's now includes Greenville. There is also a section where he has a list of early settlers, and he has the date that they came to Mason, where they lived, and what he does with that is he tells you who the early settler was, and then he's telling you in 1858 whose place it is. And so with the wall map and then this, we have a good way of pulling it back, and it gives us that. You have to be careful. He does it in alphabetical order by first letter of the last name, but within the letter it is not alphabetical, so you have to juggle a little bit as you research that. The Mason history also has a section of biographical sketches of various people, and that's helpful because sometimes included in that are dates of when they came or when they built a building. There are 12 lithographs in that book, and there are 14 lithographs. 12 of them are of houses in Greenville, and 2 of them are houses in Mason. There's also some biographical information there that's helpful. Then I use as a source a newspaper article on old houses that was written by T.A. Eaton, that's Archie Eaton. And I also use notes that he did from his interview with Henry P. Gainey, a town clerk, and he did that in the summer of 1951. But that generally doesn't go back into the 1700s. It's more in the mid to late 1800s that he's doing. I also use as a source of information the 2 histories of New Ipswich, the Kidder history and the Chandler and Lee history. That is helpful for genealogical information because when settlement occurred, families moved around. Town lines weren't like the Berlin Wall, and so there was overlap, and sometimes you find information in other town histories that applies to Greenville and that. Then the Henry Dunster genealogy is a good source of information for dating houses. It includes in it sections of when houses were built and who the builder was, and so that's helpful. I also had access to 2 history talks, one by Flora Kimball, done in 1938, and another one by Beatrice Taft. Both came from old families, would have had source information coming down about old houses. And then sometimes you can do checks on deeds. Deeds don't always tell you when houses were built, but it sometimes will refer to the property as having a house on it. And so you can go to the Registry of Deeds in Hillsborough County in Nashua, and those have the deeds from 1771 to the present. The reason it starts at 1771 is that's when the king authorized the division of New Hampshire into counties. Prior to that, you had to go to Portsmouth to record your deed, and that means that lots of people just didn't bother to have their deeds recorded, saved them, and handed them over to the next owner if they chose to do that. You will find that the records, though, for the provincial period prior to 1771 are in the state archives in Concord, New Hampshire. You can also possibly do road layouts for research on houses because the road layouts will say from the house of so-and-so to somebody else's house, and that gives you a clue as it goes forward. For Greenville, anything prior to 1872, road layouts would be with the town clerk for the town of Mason. And then you can also go to the New Hampshire census that was done in 1800 for the federal census, and that's helpful because that tells you who the head of household was and ages in certain categories as you go forward, and so you know that they were living in the town in 1800, and so that is good. So now we're going to move into the actual pictures, and the first picture is of a house at 84 Livingston Road, and this was where the Livingston family lived for a number of years, but prior to them was the Allen family, and then prior to them the Colonel James Wood, who built the house. And I just want to go with each family. The first reason that this picture is in, and you can see a barn off to the right, in the background is looking to the east, and you can see two fields that are there. That is the present Greenville Estates off of Old Ashby Road. But the road right in front of us, where you just see the ruts, is the Livingston Road. And there are descendants of the Livingston family still in this area. And so we're going to go to the next picture, which I think is helpful, and I would call this a twofer, because you've got the picture of the house, but you also have the picture of the Livingston family, and all of those people are identified on the back of that picture. One of them, the youngest child sitting there, is Hattie Livingston, and 50 years ago, she was the queen of the Greenville Centennial celebration, and so there's that. But there are descendants and relatives of this Livingston family still in the Greenville, either in Greenville or in New Ipswich and stuff. But they bought from the Allen family, and in the Allen family, two of the daughters of that family, one was Abby Allen and one was Louisa Allen Kimball. Louisa Allen married a Kimball, and so became the grandmother of lots of Greenville descendants, if you will. Her sister Abby Allen never married. She was a school teacher and taught in various district schools in the area, and also here in Mason Village, Greenville, in the grammar school, which meant she had the upper grades, and she did that for her life career. She also was the first female clerk of the Congregational Church, so she pushed the envelope a little bit there when she got elected to that position. The Allen family bought the property from Colonel James Wood, who was a cabinet maker, and that is an easy one because the Mason history at page 306 says that he came to Mason in 1780 and built the house where Oliver Allen now lives. And so this one is one where I can say with great certainty was built in 1780. So the next house that we're going to is 102 Merriam Hill Road. It's up on the east side. I knew it as a kid as the Flynn Place. The house has been moved back now a bit from the road, but for the longest time it was in the Russell family, and Isaac Russell shows on the 1858 wall map, and Hubbard Russell, it was his father, and that's in 1772 that he came to Mason. His name causes us concern when you're doing research because Hubbard isn't always spelled Hubbard. It was Hobart, H-O-B-A-R-T, and they were doing phonetic things. The interesting thing with this house is that we have some residents of Greenville on this date who are descendants of the Russell family. They are not direct of this branch, but they are common relatives, and so they're here. Hubbard Russell bought the property from Nathan Whipple, and Nathan Whipple came to Mason in 1768, and it shows on the tax list in the Mason history. It shows on the plan of Mason at page 32, and he bought the land from a Josiah Stevens in 1767. So I think it's fair to say that he probably built right around 1768 for this house. Then the next one that we go to is up on Merriam Hill on 51 Mason Road, Pleasant View Farm. And this property has been for the longest time in my lifetime in the Frost family. There was a brief period where it was owned by someone with the last name of Reed, but prior to that it was in the Merriam family. And this is a picture that shows in the Mason history of the house of Moses Merriam. And it's what we would know today as Frost Farm Service in the barn building to the left. And if you look at the house and the shed, it's identical to what you see today. Joseph Merriam came to Mason in 1769. He shows on the first tax list. He lived here, and then he moved over onto Merriam Hill Road to where another place and the Merriam Hill Center are. But those houses were built either in 1800 or after. And so he is there. But he had bought 2 lots. He bought lots 9 and ranges 12 and 13 in the original layout. And so with this, I would anticipate that this house dates to 1769 when Joseph Merriam arrived. Now we're going to go down into the village, and this is 64 Main Street, and I think the sources indicate to us that it was built by Timothy Dakin in the 1780s. It's an interesting picture because it shows, I'm concerned about the salt box house to the right. On the left is a house that was a replacement house that burned in the 1900s, I believe in the 1950s. But in back of that house, you can see the Columbian Mill number 4 with the belfry. And I think it's interesting. It's also interesting to look at the salt box house and you see the big chimney. And I'm going to tell you that I don't believe that that's the chimney that goes with the house. I think that's a chimney that goes with the mill properties in back of the house. The Deacon Amos Dakin came to Mason in 1768, and he bought the saw and grist mill that year. He bought that from his relatives, Charles Barrett and Thomas Barrett. And the Barretts show up in the biographical sections. Charles Barrett, after he dealt with the mills here, the saw and grist mill on the river, he went off to New Ipswich, and Charles Barrett and Thomas Barrett married sisters. They were Minot, was their last name, out of Concord. The Barretts were out of Concord. And then Deacon Amos Dakin marries a third sister, so there is relationship between the families. But I also came across a deed from Amos Dakin to his son Timothy Dakin in 1788, and it has a reference to the dwelling house lately built. And so that would be the salt box house that we see in this picture that they're referring to. This is consistent with the article that Archie Eaton wrote, and so I would say that this house was built in the 1787 or 1788 period. I think that we will talk about a house that is to the left, which I said burned, when I go further into another house here in the village. So now we're going to move off to 5 High Street, which has been in the Eaton family now for a long, long time. Many of you will recognize the little well house to the right. That has not changed. The house has changed significantly over the years with renovations and additions and deletions. If you look to the back left, you will see a house with a bit of a window and some other things. That is the first rectory for the Catholic Church here in town. But this house was for a long period of time in the Adams family, and it was owned by Nathan Adams, son of Abel Adams, and shows on the 1858 wall map as that. But prior to the Adamses, it was the Abner Chickering property, and Abner Chickering was a blacksmith. His wife was Eunice Dakin, daughter of Deacon Amos Dakin, and he married her in 1792. He came to Mason around 1788 and would have built the house right around that period of time. He moved off to New Ipswich in the early 1800s, but it is of note with this house that this is the house where Jonas Chickering, the son of Abner Chickering, was born. Jonas spent his early years before going to New Ipswich here in Mason Village. He became famous because he developed pianos and went to Boston, had a large factory there, and actually surfing the internet I found that one of his pianos had been bought by one of the Habsburgs in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it's actually on display in a museum in Vienna to this day and stuff. So that's what this is. I would say that this house was built right around 1788. Then we move on to 11 Temple Street, And this may indeed be the oldest house here in Mason Village, Greenville, the downtown area and stuff. It's a moved house. It originally was most likely over on where the Dakin lot is that I showed with Amos Dakin and Timothy Dakin in the Saltbox house. And I would show it as being that the article that Beatrice Taft did of the history of Greenville, she writes that the first settlement in this area was as early as 1752. And she's not referring to this house as a 1752, but she goes on and says Mrs. Bruno's house, considered one of the oldest houses here, now on Temple Street, was once either down near the site of the present townhouse or up on the hill a little near the little old Saltbox house. It still has the lovely little dados and panelings, and it has evidently had some little fireplaces once, but it was modernized and changed for greater comfort. Deacon Dakin was supposed to have owned and lived in it, and that would be consistent with it being over on Main Street and his having been there, and then as his wealth grew, he outgrew it, built a new house, and so forth and so on. And so we have that. It's also followed up by the history that George F. Merriam writes, and he writes that after removal, the structure is still standing on Temple Street opposite the residence of James Taft. And the residence of James Taft is now owned by Jim and Jean Lambert. This house is also referred to in the article that T.A. Eaton wrote, and so it's here. Deacon Amos Dakin came to Mason Village in 1768, and I would anticipate that this house was built either in 1768 or 1769. Then we move on to a house outside of the village, and this is 215 Adams Hill Road, once known as Maple Hill Farm because it had a row of maple trees on each side of the road leading up to the house and past it. It was for a long time owned by the Adams family, Sewell F. Adams, and prior to him by the Elliott family. This picture is actually a picture of a daguerreotype that was sold at an auction of some of Archie Eaton's possessions after his death, and it went for a significant price at the time. It's an older picture. You see the house. Also on the left side, you can see an opening sort of thing. It's possible that that's a barn roof, but I don't think so. I think it's looking over to one of the hills on Adams Hill, and that's field that we're looking at. It was in the Elliott family, and we find in the Mason history that John Elliott came to Mason in 1766. He had a son who was the Reverend William Elliott, who's listed as coming in 1767. William Elliott has an interesting side history because he was the first Baptist minister in Mason, and of course, even though he was a Baptist, he was compelled to pay real estate taxes to support the existing order, the Congregational Church in Mason, and he did so because he had to. But it's an interesting sort of thing as we look at that. The Elliots bought a double lot from the original layout, and so it sometimes is harder to tell who for why, but I can say with confidence that this house was built at least as early as 1766 and might have been built a little bit earlier. And so that's that old house. And then we move along to 365 Adams Hill Road, also Fairview Farm. It was in my parents' and my brother's ownership for quite some time now, but prior to that it was with George Robbins or his father David Robbins, and then prior to that with some interim owners it was for a long period of time owned by Elnathan Boynton, and he bought the property from Oliver and Jane Scripture. But I want to talk a little bit about Elnathan Boynton because he was a brother to John Boynton, who was a tin merchant and heavily involved in the sale of tinware. John Boynton grew up in Mason, in the northeast part of Mason, he left and ended up over in north central Massachusetts. He left the money for the founding of Worcester Polytechnical Institute in Worcester. He also left to the town of Mason a significant amount of money for that time for the Mason-Boynton Common School Fund, which was the interest from that fund was to be applied to defray costs of education of Mason students. The middle school in New Ipswich is named for John Boynton, and so there's this connection as we go forward. Then with Oliver and James Scripture in the Mason history, it shows that they came to Mason in 1775. He bought the property from a John Merriam, and I can't track that for sure, but it would appear that definitely the Scriptures had a house right when they came or shortly thereafter, and so this would date to around 1775. This is not a 1775 picture by any means. This is a picture in the early 1900s, either 1906 or 1908, when the barn is brand new and built. And so those are the pictures of houses that I can definitely do, but I'm going to throw in a couple of houses and tell you that they might be from the 1700s, but I'm not sure. And this is one of them. It's at 15 Hubbard Road. It's what I would call the Richardson and Farah house, because it was in those families for such a long period of time. Again, this is one of those pictures where it's a twofer. We've got the house, but we also have the family, and they're identified on the back. I think it's a fun picture because they did the picture, even though the fence is broken in the front and stuff. But I wanted you to look at this picture and compare it to the picture on the right, because the two stones that show the walkway going up to the house are no longer there. But we can date the pictures in sequence. The one on the left is the earlier one, because if you look at the shrub that forks, it's a smaller shrub in the picture with the people, and then to the right is the same shrub as it's older. And I don't know whether it's a lilac bush or what it is, but it's there. I would share that there's three others that might come into possibly being pre-1800, but I cannot verify it. One is 142 Adams Hill Road. The problem that I have with that house is that it's in the Bullard family, and I cannot come out with it such that I am comfortable in saying that it's pre-1800. I also say that 17 Temple Street might be one, but again, I cannot verify that, and so we go forward. I often look at the small little cape on Pleasant Street, but the problem I have saying that that's prior to 1800 is that Pleasant Street was not laid out until the 1820s. And so unless it was a moved house, I cannot do it. And so that should give you some of the history of houses that are old houses in Greenville that predate 1800. And so I thank you for your attention, and that concludes what I have to say.